Welcome to another episode of The Art of Feminine Negotiation. I'm your host, Cindy Watson, and I am so thrilled to be here today with Pam Lester. So welcome, Pam. It is so great to have you here.
Thank you, Cindy. I'm so happy to be invited. Thank you.
Now, you guys are in for a treat today. Today, we're going to be talking about negotiating as a woman in a man's world and other great stuff. And for those of you who don't know Pam, Pam is no stranger to today's topic because she was one of the first women attorneys in pro sports. She was the first woman president of the Sports Lawyer Association. She was the first woman chair of the American Bar Association Forum on the Entertainment, Arts, and Sports Industries, the first woman chair of the sports division of the ABA Forum on Entertainment, Arts, and Sports Industries. And she's worked both as an attorney and a business executive in the sports and entertainment industries. Both tend to be very male dominated. And Pam specialized in licensing and endorsement deals for athletes, for everything from tennis to golf to soccer to boxing and Olympic athletes. And she also created plans for HBO properties, including launching the licensing for the inimitable series and genre-changing series The Sopranos and genre-changing series Sex and the City. So Pam has led a really interesting and varied career. So excited to get her perspectives here. So Pam, as an attorney myself, I was really intrigued by your legal career. I mean, it sounds very sexy and dramatic. So why don't you tell us a bit about your experience generally and as a woman negotiating in those, predominantly male worlds?
Thank you, Cindy. I actually think, having heard you speak many times, that we have very similar backgrounds, although yours was different with labor law and collective bargaining. But typically, I was the only woman in the room for negotiating. And even, as late as 2000, when I was still employed, there might be 20 men in a room and me, and sometimes our CFO is a woman. And, but I grew up with two brothers. I was an athlete growing up, and I was used to being around men and not intimidated. And it's just, I think it's just the way it happened. I was the first freshman class, co-ed class in my college. And I think it's historical that the things I wanted to do were just opening up to women then. And also the first group of women EMTs in the local fire department ambulance. So it just, I guess it just sort of happened. Probably maybe, thanks to the fact that I grew up with two brothers. I credit them and my mom, who always stressed being independent and strong, with being able to deal with all the stuff that was coming my way.
Nice. I love that. And so how did you come to that world? I mean, other than that background, what sort of drew you to that? It sounds like you were always attracted to those kind of cutting edge for women sort of introducing. Was that conscious, or what drew you to that?
No, not at all. I mean, I was interested in sports. I was probably last generation of 3-sport athletes in college. I played field hockey, squash, and lacrosse. Not that I knew what squash was before, I saw a squash court, but I played tennis not so well before that. Yeah. And so when I was in law school, I just, the two things interest me were either being a prosecutor, but then, I believe in the justice system, but ultimately I didn't want to make my career there. Yeah. And actually when I interviewed, the DA had said, well, this maybe a little off topic, but sometimes just by numbers, someone innocent is convicted and goes to jail. Can you deal with that? And I said, no, but I love sports. And when I was in law school, I first started out working at an admiralty firm, shipping law, and then didn't really care.
Also male dominated. So funny.
Right, exactly. That's right. And then I ended up being the squash and racquetball pro at a fancy club in New York City, and the men's professional tennis world was practicing there for the season-ending Masters at Madison Square Garden. And so I talked to the guys when I was in between jobs, and I said, I want to be a sports agent. And actually, to backtrack, I think when I was in college, my mom sent me an article from the New York Times about a woman who was representing Tracy Austin and said, this is what you should do. Yeah. So it's a combined law and sports. And so this is always so many people really want to get into sports. And this is my cautionary tale. I went to meet with his agent. He offered me a desk and a chair and 25% of whatever I could bring in, representing both men and women in tennis. And I thought, I know nothing about representing tennis players. So I turned it down because, 25% of zero is going to be zero. I ended up being hired by one of the big sports agencies. And it turns out that, 8 or 9 years later, he went to jail for embezzling money from his clients. So that's always my go-to advice is be careful who you work for, because that reputation can follow you. And but even my interviews on to work for the sports agencies, I mean, one of them, they were just looking for women to man a tennis tournament in Vermont at the desk, to do sign-ins, whatever. And so women were just a commodity who would come and go. And I had a friend whose brother-in-law was a client. And he basically said, don't go to this company because there's no place to go.
Wow.
women. So, it's just like happenstance.
I love that you trusted your instincts too. And I think that's a great message out there for our listeners and our viewers, right? I mean, sometimes when you get those intuitive hits, sometimes trust them, right? So there was obviously something that stopped you from going with that one character. And it's interesting, Pam, we do have similar backgrounds, because I had really considered at one point as well that sort of doing the prosecution. I mean, I love labor. I was very driven on that. But when I interviewed, and I worked as volunteer probation officer for one period, and that was an eye opener, let me tell you. So in the courts, and seeing lots of injustice, where, as you say, people who had money and or knew how to play the system were sort of able to manipulate it. And you'd see these young kids, typically people of color, coming in and just getting railroaded for offenses that you're like, oh, this just doesn't sit well. So I'd love to hear a bit more about, like, and I love that story about how you got in. It sounds like, I mean, it was this comedy of errors tripping through. So when you were sort of the only woman in those rooms at the beginning, how were you received? Any sort of input that you have for us about suggestions about how to show up or how you navigated that?
Well, first of all, I had no mentors in my office, male or female, and just the way the company was, it's very opportunistic, and just I would look at other people draft contracts, and this is just what you do. So I was just thrown in there, and and the fact is that there was a woman who was in the office before I was hired in finance, and her name was Lori, and one of the managing directors called every woman in the office Lori, and the fact is that even anyway, and even in the Sports Law Association, there was someone who always confused me with a really good friend of mine who is a Black woman, and
because we're all interchangeable, apparently.
Exactly. But the fact is, I mean, this kind of thing just didn't bother me, because my dad, we all started our names start with P, and he'd always say, Peter, Prescott, Pram, which one are you? So I wasn't sensitive to the name issues, and I think that my advice, and having spoken a lot on this, I think the advice is that all of us, no matter who we are, men or women, whether it's white or a person of color or any sexual orientation, race, national origin, there are people who are biased against us, no matter what. And and my I guess MO was just to not say anything, but register the information. So I knew who I was dealing with. And I felt that if they looked at me and thought that they underestimated me, I find that as a great strength, particularly in negotiation, because I know what I can do and they don't. So their guard is down. They think they have it over me. And I found by not calling them out on things, However, just briefly, I have to say that I did a podcast, as you know, for the Sports Lawyers Association with the two of us who are former presidents, incoming president, are women for International Women's Month, and the other very accomplished woman, I mean, they both are, but who had already been president, who started around the same era I did, said that her regret as well was not speaking out. But we didn't feel that we could speak out, and I was very careful not to join women's organizations because it would be held against me.
Yeah. Wow. I love that perspective shift, actually, Pam. I think that I don't know that I've had anybody on talk about that. I love that idea about, hey, we're all discriminated against at some point, right? And just having that awareness and shift as well, I think helps you show up differently in how you manage it. And I love that you say about seeing when people underestimate you. It's one of the things I always teach as well when I go out and do negotiation workshops, because for women in particular, one of the big myths is that women aren't great negotiators. And I think it's one of our greatest secret weapons, because if people underestimate you, as you say, that's something that you can absolutely use when people have that guard down, in terms of getting information, in terms of being able to come in with that sort of stealth mode as well, to be able, through rapport building and empathy, when you're not coming with that more traditional approach, you can actually get way better results. So I love that insight. What's one of the funniest stories? I know you've got all kinds of stories from the boxing world or whatever. So why don't you share one of your boxing stories with us from your practice?
I'm horrified with those. Well, there's so many. Well, one, I don't know. Well, I guess this show to strengthen negotiation, but we were licensing a pay-per-view fight in a city down in Atlanta, actually, and there were two bars, and they were both rumored to be owned by the mob, as they say. And I had to have our marketing guy go serve a cease and desist on someone who planned to show the fight without being licensed. And he was afraid to do it. And, and so I had to send cease and desist. And I got a phone call from him with his lawyer on. And, and there were so many threats, and maybe I was naive, but I had a friend who's FBI, and I thought, well, if I got into trouble, maybe he'd protect me, which is completely ridiculous. But, he kept saying things like, when my family had a problem with John Gotti, we got even. And I kept saying, is that a threat? Is that a threat? I was much too, I think I was young and naive. And the fact is that, as you know, that I've always been trying to be polite and professional. And so when things are going crazy around me, I just don't join in. And a lot of the guys I work with love to come back and replay. Oh, did you hear what he called me? And I said this. And I just don't get into those games. And I tend to, which helps me get along with people. And I think that's, the sort of the empathy part. Yeah. So in any event, at some point, his lawyer said, oh, Pam, I think you can handle this. He laughed, he hung up the phone. And then, of course, we weren't going to not license him. He just had to sign the deal. Yeah. End up, so sent him a license agreement. And he called me up and said, I have no problem with you. You've shown me respect. What can I do for you? And he started referencing politicians in both Atlanta, where the Olympics, were going to happen, and New York, where I'm from, and said, I'd like to do you a favor. And I'm just thinking, I saw that scene in The Godfather with the horses and the music playing, and I'm like, no, thank you. I'm just doing my job. So that was probably one of my craziest stories. But
oh, that's hilarious. And I love when you speak to that naivete, because it's so true. Sometimes ignorance is bliss, right? It can be a huge advantage. And it reminds me, sort of a different track, but that same idea about not knowing can be a great asset sometimes as well. Because when I started my own firm, I went right from, as often happens when people come from a background without a lot, I was very driven, right from high school to university to law school. And I ended up getting a job at a firm that specialized in labor law, which I knew I wanted. And I loved the clients, loved the work I did, but didn't want to be there. And I was offered a partnership pretty early. Everyone thought I was having an early midlife crisis because I turned it down. My dad was like, oh my gosh, you've worked this hard. What is happening? You're self-sabotaging. But I ended up going out on my own. And there were no women who had firms that specialized in labor. It just wasn't done. But in hindsight, I had no money, no equity, no collateral, no credit to speak of, no guarantee of clients for that matter. But it actually just never crossed my mind. I had such certainty, such absolute naivety. Well, of course, if I want to start my own practice, I can. And I go to the bank with none of the typical stuff. And just by fluke happened to get a young, a woman of color who was new as a bank manager. And I guess she saw something and took a chance on me. And sadly, it wasn't until years later that I recognized what a chance she'd taken on me. And I went back to sort of thank her profusely. But had I years later done it with all the knowledge that went with it, I may not have ever had the chutzpah to go out on my own. It was that naivete and that ignorance that allowed me to step into that. So,
I think that really helps. I think I just would tell one other very brief story, because I think it's something that I hear a lot, particularly with women who feel that they're not seen, or people of color, and are insulted. That early on, when I was just new at the sports agency, we had an issue with honestly a 12-year-old we had signed in Europe, and she wanted out of her contract. It was different then, and different in Europe. And a big firm lawyer came in with his associate, and how they sit down for deposition with the newspaper. So and the first thing he asked me was to get him a cup of coffee, and I said, would you like milk and sugar, because I'm polite, right? Yeah. And it just. And of course, it didn't even occur to me that he thought I was, an assistant or the receptionist. And then I sat down across from him, and it really disarmed him. And I just hear so many, I'm sure your clients too, who have these perceived insults, which might, which are in a way insulting, but not letting it. Again, that's being underestimated, in the end. And luckily, we settled, and we didn't have a deposition, because I'd never defended a deposition in my life. Yeah. I was hugging the federal rules of evidence, but I think that requires having a thick skin and knowing what you want and sticking to your goals.
Yeah. Well, and actually, you've just touched on something that might be worth sharing with our audience as well, because as soon as you said about, geesh, I'd never defended a deposition in my life, I remember those early days in the practice of law. And back then in particular, I don't know about your experience, but it was very much sink or swim, right? Like you say, you weren't given mentors, and I was given my first cases. I had articled at the labor board. So that was a very different experience. I hadn't actually even seen an arbitration or been in, sort of one of those proceedings, and suddenly I'm in there as lead counsel handling this stuff. And I found sometimes it was that just know when to speak, right? Just show up. For me, at least I would say, show up with confidence. Like no matter how much butterflies you have, right? Think of that butterflies as internal applause that you're getting out of your comfort zone. Do whatever the heck mindset shift you have to, but just show up with absolute confidence, even if you're not feeling it inside, especially if you're not feeling it inside. And just sit and really listen, take it in, take as much as you can, and wait. When you see those opportunities, when you've got something to add, jump in and add it so you start building that credibility. So any tips that you would have for people when you feel that you're in a situation where you maybe you feel like you don't know enough or it's a little overwhelming? What tips would you give in that situation? How do you handle it?
Well, first of all, I agree with you completely that sometimes I was absolutely petrified, but the trick is not to show your fear.
Yeah.
And not to feel that you have to fill the air. And and so if you need time to regroup and to think. And the other thing is that if you don't know something, I believe that it's okay to say you don't know. Much better than bluffing. And you might end up, getting yourself in trouble.
Yeah.
And I think that's fine. And then of course, calling in help. You can always take a break. Well, not always. I mean, if you're, but even in trial, you could take a break. It's like calling a timeout on the sports field and get advice or regroup or do what you need to do. Or but I think too, I mean, I'd go into negotiations that, that were quite volatile, only in boxing. And honestly, my biggest negotiations day to day were not with the opposing parties to make a deal, because I had leverage. I was representing the company. They had no choice but to deal with me. And I tended not to have problems. And of course, there was, some level of, sexual harassment, like verbally, but I just ignored it, played dumb, and always took everything so literally that I just drove them crazy and they stopped. But I would say that my biggest, day-to-day negotiation was for myself and my job to, for parity and for real responsibility.
Yeah.
So, and again, it's just showing confidence and not, like what I was thinking about the people, I don't let them know because that wouldn't be helpful.
Yeah. I love that. I love that. One of the things I always teach as well, your first and most important negotiation is always going to be negotiating your own mindset, right? Every day you get the opportunity to hit the reset and decide how you want to show up. In any negotiation, you get to hit that reset and decide how you want to show up. And I love that you touched on about just owning it sometimes. Because again, as you know, one of my models is that no fear negotiating, and the E is that ego, and ego shows up in different ways. But for so many people, we've been so conditioned to believe, and part of our ego shows up by never wanting to admit when we don't know something, thinking that that's going to bolster our credibility. And studies show the opposite. I totally agree with you, Pam. When you gain way more credibility, people will trust you more when you just simply will say, you know what, I'm not sure of the answer to that, but let me look into it and I'll get back to you. That buys way more leverage than bluffing or blustering. And people see through that and you get caught out and then your credibility's shot. I don't know what your thoughts are on that.
Yeah, I completely agree. And what's more difficult than saying you don't know something is knowing what you don't know.
Yeah.
Because sometimes, we think we know something and we really don't. And that also can lead to trouble. And so research preparation and not, I mean, obviously in negotiations, people bluff, but that's on deal terms. That's or knowledge sometimes. But I agree with you, Cindy.
Yeah. And so important that knowing what we don't know, these are great. And again, for our listeners there, these are little nuggets. So pick this stuff up and dig on it and really let it resonate with you as well. And that goes back to that empathy piece, I think, that you talked about at the beginning, Pam, because when you come from a place of empathy, you're truly wanting to put yourself in the shoes of the other party. Not that you have to agree with them, but at least to understand their position. And when we talk too much in negotiations, we've been conditioned to believe that's a sign of the person who's winning. And in my experience, I think the opposite is true. Sit back and listen, learn what you don't know about what even just understanding the other person's position, but you also might be surprised when you truly open up and listen actively. It's amazing what information might come that can totally change the direction that the deal was going to go in much more positive ways. Or the opposite is true. Maybe a deal that you were really hungry for, when you really open up to understand and listen and be open to acknowledging that there's stuff you don't know, you may realize this deal isn't for you at all. So I don't know what your experience has been on that.
Oh, I agree with you. And I don't know if, I know you have clients all over the world. I don't know if you're familiar in Canada with that. There's an old police show called Columbo, and Peter Falk.
I love Columbo.
He's a detective in a rumpled raincoat. And I just remember this one episode where he's looking at a vent and he goes, what is that? Is that an air conditioning vent, and the guy next to him says, "Oh no, that's where I hid the stolen art." And and I just think that being more of a stealth negotiator, taking information, and then you have it when you need it. And I find, and that's what I find, that the people that feel that they have to say something all the time or
Yes.
disclosing things, and and the important thing is getting that deal done,
Yeah.
or whatever it is that you're negotiating, getting where you want to be. And it's not a, usually it's not a race. I mean, sometimes there's actually there's a time where it has to close,
Yeah.
but you're not volunteering information,
Yeah.
that like sometimes I think people for ego want to say, well, I know, but
Absolutely.
and they do know, but I think often it's better not to reveal that, because that's that's more leverage.
Yeah, every time you're talking, you're giving nuggets of information to the other side that they can use, right? I love Columbo. When you said that, I just got such an image of him. He's always, remember when he was always just on his way out the door and then he turned back, oh, just one more question. And then you were always like, oh, this is it. I love that. That was a great show. I'm going to have to go find some reruns of that, maybe. So what would you say were some of your biggest challenges in that practice in that world, Pam?
I would say, honestly, it was, being a woman, being told I was too honest, I mean, too nice.
Yeah, God
And
forbid.
even when I was, when I was home with my son, I coached girls lacrosse at a local middle school, and my team, actually had a winning season and beat the big rival after 15 years. And the varsity coach took me aside and said, "You're too nice. This isn't how we coach here." And yet I had a better season because the parents were upset that after every game I would disclose the name of every single girl in bold and say she had done something positive.
I love that.
And and there are just so many of these stereotypes that work against. And then of course, as many of your clients I'm sure have shared with you, that if you fight back, then that's perceived as being too aggressive, and you don't fit in, and there's so many things that happened to me, negotiating my salary or my exit from a company, and being asked, well, doesn't your husband work? I was interviewed for the CEO of the women's tennis tour, and I was a newlywed, and one of the board members who was from Australia asked me, "Are you trying to have a child?" And I was thinking, like, oh my goodness,
God.
it was bad enough hearing that from my mother-in-law. Yeah, so there's just I think that the toughest thing for me was the perception of being a woman, because what people expected, and having to diffuse it, be myself, and just continually working behind the scenes in my own way to forge my path. And and to do that, and honestly, that's why I have all these things with the bar associations, because I taught sports law, I spoke, and then of course at the time they didn't know any women, so I was the one woman that they look at an old program and say, oh, well, there's Pam Lester, and then and then I spoke in all these places, and I remember there was one guy who said to me, well, you're only on these programs because you're a woman. And but I knew he was only on this committee because his father had called the committee chair. So this is a question that I've heard a lot, and from people I've met, and that's I feel like I'm a token, and I'm upset about it. And my feeling is, hey, if someone gives you an opportunity, even if it's passive aggressive or backhanded or whatever you want to call it, take it. It's an opportunity. Take advantage. That's their problem. They have that bias, but for you, it's an opportunity, and you don't turn it down on ceremony. Take it and make the most of it.
I love that. And again, I want to repeat that. Don't turn it down on ceremony. I've had this argument so many times with women going, well, I don't want the job because of that. And especially in trade union movement with my clients, where, I'd be advocating for a long time to have more female representation on their boards, right? And when they have their conferences, and women are, and so many of the women at the conference who, had been minimized and discounted for decades, we're like, well, I don't want to get the position just because I'm a woman. I agree with you. You take that opportunity to be able to have that voice and make a difference. And like for you, Pam, the path that you forged by being the first woman in all of those positions, I think is amazing. So I love that. So kudos. Now, women tend to be more likely, I find, probably because of all that conditioning you're talking about as well, to shy away from negotiating generally, I think for a host of reasons, but in particular tied to social conditioning, and even more so in advocating for themselves. So do you have any advice for women who fall into that? I mean, I think we have those two categories, right? Either shying away from negotiating or sometimes overcompensating a bit. Do you have any advice for women, both female attorneys, but also just for the general population, if you will, about how to overcome that?
That's a really good question. And I have to admit that negotiating for myself with my bosses, not a problem. I go in there, negotiate, and all
Yeah.
the nonsense I got, no problem. I spoke up. Negotiating for myself when I was out, out on my own and setting my prices, and then someone would call me, and I'm like, oh, that's so easy. I just tell them on the initial phone call and not charge them. So I was, really terrible on that, and that is something, that takes work. I think, in terms. I don't know why. And I think that, many people are subject to that. And
Yeah.
the other thing is that just in day to day, I'm so grateful that I had this background in negotiation. And by the way, I am not a conflict lover. I don't love to negotiate. I'm a consensus builder. I'm more of a mediator. I want everyone to get along. I want everyone to like me, all those things that, we're not supposed to do. But, in the world, particularly having a child, I mean, being able to negotiate, subtly, under the radar with teachers, with doctors,
Yes.
and not knowing how to do it. And with other moms, I've certainly, had discussions and given advice on this is how you have to do this, because I think one of the important things is to recognize who you're dealing with. For instance, for teachers don't want to hear from parents complaining. Parents are trying to invade their job, but only your child.
Yeah.
And the teachers have different, if you understand that they have different pressures on them. They have quotas they have to, I don't know, it's not quotas, but they have things they have to meet. Like, I need X percent, or I need to teach these things no matter what. And there's, so they're held under, they're accountable in different ways. And I think that negotiating daily life, it's so important to do what you talked about, Cindy, and that's to have empathy, do your research, know what's driving them, know what you want. And as you advocate for your child or negotiate for a car, I mean, cars, I could go on and on cars. Cars are simple. Yeah, and then my advice on cars is do your research online,
Yeah.
and then negotiate not in person. And I know that advice always is, don't negotiate by email, but buying a car, because they, at least in the US, I've had crazy experiences. They see a woman and they think they can pull it over you. And, and cars, if you even if you have your heart set on a certain car or model, there are other dealers that you can buy from.
Absolutely.
And all this information is online. And, I've had crazy experiences that one day I'll share with you. I haven't bought that many cars, it's like 2 or 3, but every time. So, I think that negotiating daily life is very important, and there are ways to do it to make you more comfortable. For example, buying a car, you don't have to be in person where someone's going to put pressure on you. And, even I once had someone literally kick the tires on my old car outside the window at the dealership. So,
jeez, oh my gosh. It's funny when you talk about that sexism, though, as you were telling that story about, I've had crazy experiences buying a car. It's a lot of the retail as well. It's amazing how, because I remember once before I was, this is a while back now, it was before I was married, and I was dating this guy from Australia, and we went out to this really high-end speaker shop, and I wanted to get a new set of speakers. So I'm the customer, I'm the one purchasing. And the entire conversation, this really hardcore, hard pressure salesman, going at the guy that I'm dating, everything directed at him, ignoring me. And at one point, the only time he even acknowledged me, he turned to me and he said, you know what? It would be like for you just really finding that perfect dress. And I just turned to Ross and said, okay, we're out of here. So it's like, wow, that's incredible. And I'm so glad, Pam, that you raised about the parenting piece, because as we started late and had 3 kids in 3 years, made up for lost time. And our daughter had to have open heart surgery. So there were a lot of sort of special needs that came as she was, delayed in hitting a lot of those markers. And then our son was born, and he had, some cognitive issues as well, in terms of, he was dyslexic, and he had, God, I forget the term now, when he was a kid, cognitive something. Anyhow, his hearing was compromised. So when there was noise in the room, he ended up not being able to process information, right?
Central audio processing. Or
That's the one. Thank you. Central auditory processing issues. And there were all of these accommodations that were supposed to be made in the classrooms that were never being made. And again, teachers, I have the highest respect, tons of pressures, really overworked, budget cuts, but dealing with children that have any sort of special needs, the kids don't want it. So of course my son was like, no, I don't need it. And then they didn't. And being able to negotiate, recognizing that is a form of negotiating, and showing up to bring those skills can be a game changer when you're advocating for your kids. And in the healthcare, the same thing, right? Whether it's dealing with your child's physical health, as with my daughter, or mental health issues. I mean, so important to recognize those negotiation skills and recognize them as negotiating. So I'm so glad you raised that.
Yeah,
And
I've always said that this would be a great area, for you and your clients, because that day to day, I don't think parents realize that that they
yeah.
can negotiate, or they try and do it and they do it ineffectively. And my one quick story there is that when my son was in preschool, he didn't fit at all and was terrible, and we ended up taking him out. But the principal wouldn't talk to me unless my husband was there.
Oh,
And I'm thinking, I spent my career negotiating these high profile deals covered in the media, and I am a bad person because I'm a mom. All moms are hysterical, and I'm
yeah.
still the same person. I'm not in there crying and
Yeah.
yelling and swearing at the guy, although I should have
Yeah.
been,
Yes.
but it's just, as a group, again, perfect example of being, a stereotype.
Yeah,
And then someone
absolutely.
not hearing me, like you had, with the guy you're dating buying a car. And it's
Yes.
just, and so then I think it's very important to learn how to operate in that system. And
Yes.
for me, I wrote some amazing emails and
Yeah.
copied appropriate people. So there is a space for emails. It's all,
Oh, I agree.
I would call it my art of stealth negotiation.
Yes.
Negotiate with someone when they don't even know they're being negotiated with.
Yes, absolutely. And I love that. There is great power in email. So long as I always talk about intention, so long as you're making decisions with intention as opposed to being in reactive mode. And the beauty of an email is you get the luxury of time to really craft and think about what you want to say. And also in terms of that response, that you don't give that knee-jerk response, you can give yourself the luxury of time to fully consider and give a more informed answer that will suit your needs, the outcome that you're looking for, right? So yeah, I think that's a great tip. And you'd mentioned about with the lacrosse as well and being criticized for being too nice. And I think, and I know from my career, for the longest time, that was the case. I mean, I think that was the conditioning. And you've heard me say before, I bought into that going, okay, apparently they want me to show up as, I got to get scrappier. And then, they called me the Barracuda for the longest time. But I feel like there's a shift happening in the world right now. And I think COVID has really is expediting that a bit, where people are now recognizing some of these feminine traits that for so long we saw as a liability. And when I say feminine, I'm not gender based, as let's just name like that empathy and kindness and compassion and being able to bring that rapport building to the table. I think people are open now in a different way to recognizing there's some strength in that. There's some power there. And I don't know what your thoughts are on that.
I agree that the world needs empathy, and we need to be able to listen to each other. And if you look at, at least in the United States, this great political divide, no one's listening, and you have to be able to listen to the other party. And as I, that's what I told my son. I taught him, he says his great childhood regret is that he never won a negotiation against mom. However, he has learned to be a great negotiator. And, there are two things. One is, you don't win by calling the other person idiot. I mean, if you insult someone, they're no longer receptive. They're not listening. And sometimes, it's hard to, and you'll never reach agreement unless you can understand where they're coming from.
Yeah.
Or not even agreement, convince someone, persuade someone to come to your side, change their political beliefs or their, or whatever it is that you have an issue with, that without truly understanding why there's, they, at least as far as you can, you'll never really know, but what's driving them, what the real concerns are, and is there another solution that that could work?
Oh, I love that approach. And yeah, one of my good friends, super bright, very politically passionate, but every time she'd end up getting into a debate or a discussion about it, she completely lost any ability to persuade because she'd immediately be denigrating the other person. Like, how could you ever think that? That's so stupid. That's so naive. And worse, if people supported on, particular bent that wasn't hers, it was like, it's like it's the devil reincarnate. It's evil. How do you think you're going to persuade or influence somebody with that? I mean, they're going to be on the highest possible alert or guard, right?
Well, I think the trick is to keep the communication going. I mean, even with the insults, and what I saw is that people just won't even deal with each other anymore.
Yeah.
Friends are no longer friends.
Absolutely.
Families are split, and they're just not even. I mean, they're not even talking to each other to say, like, this is ridiculous. How can you believe this?
Yeah.
And and I think that goes to negotiations too. They can break down over personal issues and anger and name calling, and then it's time to step back and think and regroup.
Well, it's funny because you've just started to answer it. I was going to say, what advice or sort of hot tips do you have for negotiating with bullies or people with more power? And one that you've just said is like find ways to keep the conversation going in more sort of authentic ways. What other tips would you have around that, Pam?
Well, I think there's so many. Well, it depends on the context. I mean, being bullied in negotiation, you have just don't give into it. Honestly, don't fall for the bait. Don't go there. I mean, and that used to happen to me even in the office when, there's one guy, just everything he said has some kind of sexual innuendo. And I just ignore. I mean, this is way back in like 1984, and his assistant would come to me all the time in tears because he said such and such. And he'd say the same thing to me. And I would just be very stone-faced and say, well, what do you mean by that? And then he finally said, "Oh, forget it. You just don't get it." And, this is, so that's one way. But the other thing is that I always call the bluff.
Yeah.
So if someone says, and particularly, I mean, if someone's lying and I know they're lying and they said so-and-so said something, then very innocently, I will, send an email to so-and-so copying this person and say, they said you said this. I'm trying to understand why you think that. And then, of course, the answer comes back, well, I never said that, and why did you copy the person? I'm like, well, I just wanted to know more. So, in terms of dealing with that kind of, underhanded, bullying type thing and leverage. And then the leverage, of course, ultimately becomes, if you know what drives them, what they need. I really believe in the art of an effective email and copying whoever it is who can put an end to it. And, and oftentimes in very subtle ways. I mean, not calling them out, but, just play, I'd hate to say play dumb, but I mean, in a way that's that Columbo model. And my one advice I forgot to mention on email is, which I learned the hard way, and I think we all have, when you're drafting these emails and working on them and finessing them, make sure if you're replying all, take out the addresses while you're drafting so that you don't send it too early and regret it. Yeah. And sometimes it's a good idea, if you have an email in the midst of something very contentious, personally or professionally, that you wait and read it and reread it and redraft it. And also, you probably can tell by my answers, I tend to be long-winded. And so then I spend a lot of time cutting down this long email to something that any normal person would read.
That is great, great advice. And it's funny when you bring up the liar, I just had that come up recently. So I'd love your feedback on that and any other tips you have for when you're dealing with the liar. Because, I just read a study out of Harvard recently, and they talked about the fact that the average person lies multiple times a day. So what advice do you have for dealing with the sort of pathological liar in the workplace?
Well, I mean, first of all, the daily lies, we've all been taught to say, "Oh, I love your haircut," or whatever. That's a beautiful dress. So, because you want people to feel good. But that's, those are what, those are meant to be good. But if you're dealing with a liar, that's where really doing your homework. So, the person is lying, it's very helpful. And if you say you're lying, they're going to say, "I'm not lying." So what you need evidence, or you need someone else to call them out on it. And that's where, oftentimes I end up with proof of some sort, whether it's, I have documents or research that shows, or particularly when they claim that someone told them something, I always, basically when I'm dealing with a liar, I always call them out, but I don't say you're lying. I just play along like I believe them. And then ultimately, of course, they're lying. And so it's, it becomes very evident from a third party that they're lying or from the situation.
Yeah, great strategy. I love that. So
and now everyone knows.
Yeah. That's beautiful. I love it. And when you talk about doing your homework, I mean, preparation is a big part of negotiation, right? So what do you see as the most important elements of preparation in your view to a negotiation?
Well, I think, first of all, you need to know what you want to accomplish and really know, and also know what your range is of what's acceptable. And then of course you want to, you have to figure out what you think the other party's going to ask for before they even show up, what type of pressure they might have on them. And also, oftentimes who they are. I mean, I know when I was doing licensing and merchandising at, for Soprano Sex and the City, we had potential licensees come in who wanted the business so badly. I remember one man literally mopping his brow, so grateful to have a meeting. And then, like the year before that, I'd be in a meeting with boxing promoters and lawyers and executives where I just had to gird myself for for what was coming, because it was just be so tense and nasty and, and vitriolic, and people slamming their fists on the table and turning bright red, and me thinking like, oh my goodness, I'm going to have to do CPR on this guy if he has a heart attack.
Sounds like some of my trade union negotiations. Yeah.
So it's, so I think, preparing yourself mentally. I mean, we talked about that, particularly if you're, if you're uncomfortable, just know this is going to be uncomfortable, but I can't show weakness. I mean, sometimes you show weakness, like I don't know something, but that's not what I'm talking about. Don't show fear, because then the other party, particularly with bullies, then they'll really zone in. So you
Yeah.
have to look like none of the nonsense that you're hearing, particularly if you're being bullied or lied
Yeah.
to, is bothering you, and just, keep cool. But, I think, and then also, it's part of, it's negotiating, that you have to be able to think on your feet and be nimble. And as new information comes in, always keeping your eye on what your goals are for that
Yeah.
negotiation. But, coming in with more preparation, and there's so much information available on, if it's a business deal, doing your research, finding out what terms are, what they've done with others. So there's very little that's brand new. I shouldn't say that, because now there's this whole, Bitcoin
Yeah.
and NFTs and everything else, but still, there are people you can talk to educate yourself. The more you know about the industry and the deal
Absolutely.
and what you want, the better you are when you go in.
Yeah. Yeah. I love that. I think preparation, if you look at those pie charts, preparation can outdo natural skill sets any day, right? So some people, people who feel like, oh, this doesn't come naturally to me, that's all I often say. Preparation is such a big chunk of that determination of success. And that is something that you have absolute control over. So I love that.
That's really good advice.
Yeah, thanks. And so how would you recommend advocating? Because I love this approach that you have, Pam, like in the word, this unflappable, unruffled kind of calm serenity to still get the job done in a way where you're not in reactive mode. So what tips would you have for people? Like, how do you remain true to yourself, right? Like not feeling the need to tap into that more masculine definition of success to be able to advocate to get what you want?
That's a tough question. And I have to say that even though I was outwardly unflappable, when I left the boxing world, my shoulders just went down. I was just like, oh, no one's screaming anymore. And honestly, it was very rare that they screamed at me, because I was still, polite and professional and respectful, no matter the situation. But they still got angry because, being an in-house lawyer, oftentimes I had to defend my own team who had changed their minds on things. I knew the person on the other end of the phone was, had a reason to be angry. So, I think that probably just comes with practice. And some people innately, have that strength and, self-confidence, but it's just going to come with practice, I think, just being in those situations and knowing you can do it. And of course, just like so many conversations, you might think, oh, I should have said something, but it's just, every step is getting closer.
I love that. Actually, that's a really great point, because that goes back to that confidence competence loop. And I think that's really important, again, for our listeners and our viewers out there. Sometimes just get outside your comfort zone and just do it, try it. And you're going to make mistakes, and that's okay, because every time you get out there and you do it, you learn something, right? It's only a failure if you don't learn the lessons from it and take something. So as you gain competence, you'll get more confidence. And as you gain more confidence, you're willing to get out there and try more. And it's like, you can see I'm even subconsciously drawing the infinity loop, that confidence begets competence, which begets confidence, and you keep spiraling up. And I love that. So what would you see as the key reasons that most negotiations fail?
It's hard to come up with a reason. Sometimes they're, in business world, they're just, there's no meeting of the minds. The deal terms just don't work for each party.
Yeah.
And I really can't think of any business deals. And it's funny, because someone just asked me, can I provide an example for a case study on failed negotiations? And it's hard to think of something, because it's just, if it doesn't work, it's usually not based on the person. If it's a personal negotiation, you don't want to work for this person, or you're not going to, get hired because you don't fit. That's something else. But in terms of failed negotiations, here's some examples that I've seen just by running rooms on negotiation internationally. Sometimes we don't know that, for example, that you're negotiating a business term with executives, and you think you have an agreement, but there's a government agency that gets, that you didn't know has the right to approve or disapprove. And then that can fall apart. So again, that's going to go to research and knowing what the system is. Other than just, it doesn't work financially or for some other reason, not a business term, but sometimes it's unknown information, or that, how many times have you sat in a room, spent all this time negotiating with someone who said they had authority and they really didn't. And then it goes, back upstairs to someone else. And then, the deal could fall apart that way. So it's also knowing, who has authority, and that you're really negotiating with someone with authority. And then, it tends to be some unknown thing that comes up. And it could even be a business term that comes up. For example, we need cancellation insurance in terms of an event and can't get it. So we're not going to have that, the deal's not going to happen, because it's an outdoor event. There could be a lightning storm or something.
Yeah. Love it. Beautiful. And last, I can't believe how quick the time has gone. We're going to have to book a second one of these to be able to follow up. This would be fantastic. What would you say are the key skills or hallmarks that make for a great negotiator?
I think number one, the ability to think on your feet.
Yeah.
To take in information, be nimble, change. I have so therefore, it's it's that creativity, which of course is going to be based on listening to the other side and knowing, trying to figure out what they want. So it's also, of course, preparation, and confidence, and just I really think the number one thing that brings everything in is to be able to always be reanalyzing the information you're getting, whether it's your own research, from your team, from the other side, and who they are, what they're saying, and while always keeping your eye on the end goal.
Yeah, beautiful. I love that. And last question, I typically end by asking, what is one of the greatest mindset shifts that you've ever had? It doesn't have to be about negotiation, just in life generally. What would you say is one of those greatest sort of aha moments for you, or a mindset shift?
Oh my gosh, now that's tough. I tend to be a very left brain thinker. My mindset shift. We might have to do another one for this.
Okay.
I'm trying to think. I mean, obviously it's, trying something and then finding out I could actually do it, and being nervous about it. Okay. My number one mindset shift. I got it. Absolutely. My son, who also is dyslexic and is about to graduate from engineering school, early, thankfully, because he just has hated school every time. Yeah. My number one mindset shift was knowing what's good for him versus what I had always expected. I have not once ever asked for his grades in college.
Nice.
And just let him be and do what he does.
Yeah.
And, that was definitely a mindset shift, because I need to do what's best for him, and not, and realize, and I truly believe out in the world, he will, there's no issue at all. But, academics have never been anything he enjoyed. So that was absolutely a mindset. Sorry, it's getting late in our hour. Mindset shift.
Beautiful. I love it. That was great. Sorry to put you on the spot. So for all of our listeners and viewers out there, make sure to learn, if you want to learn more about Pam, you can check her out on Instagram and I just love this handle for Instagram. It's educate, empower, negotiate, lead. So educate.empower.negotiate.lead. So make sure to check out Pam. And I'm sure that, Pam, thank you so much for being here. This has been fantastic. I'm sure everybody got loads and loads of value from this episode. So thank you for being with us here today.
Thank you.
And for those of you as well, make sure to share this episode with anybody that you think could get some value from it, and who couldn't get value from this episode. It's been fantastic. And if you haven't already, make sure to subscribe to the podcast and make sure to share it with anyone that you think could get some value from this messaging as well. And if you haven't joined our Women on Purpose community, please do that on Facebook, facebook.com/group/Women on Purpose community. Would love to see you in there as well. And that's a wrap for this episode. So until next time, go forth and negotiate your best life on your terms so that you can stop missing out and start getting more of what you want and deserve, from the boardroom to the bedroom.